I'm Darrell Bock, Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary and Executive Director of Cultural Engagement at the Hendrick Center at the seminary.
Dr. Darrell Bock. Darrell, good to see you. Welcome to Exegetically Speaking.
Well, it's good to be back, David. It's been a while, but it's good to see you.
It's good to see you. We're here actually face-to-face. We're not doing this over Zoom, so that's always a lot of fun to see people and be able to.
We are three-dimensional beings.
We are. Yeah, most of the time.
That's right.
Except when we're on Zoom.
Exactly right.
They sort of shrink a little bit.
Exactly right. Yeah. Well, at least you're thin when you're on Zoom, right?
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I probably don't weigh what I weigh now, I guess, at that point. But you've been with us before, so we're not going to rehearse the ways that you kind of got involved in biblical languages. But we're going to jump right into the Synoptic Gospels. You've been writing on the Synoptic Gospels, researching on that for many, many years. You got a great deal of insight on that. So let's talk a little bit about how the Synoptic Gospels work. We're talking about exegesis, and knowing something about the whole helps you understand something about the particular, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that the Synoptic Gospels are kind of a challenge for people. They actually prefer the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John says it directly. It doesn't mess around. It doesn't wait. It says it in the very first verse.
Yeah.
You know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is CNN. I mean, that's how John opens up, and you're off and running, and you know exactly what John's doing from the very first verse. So John does all our heavy lifting for us. But the synoptics work in a different way. They show how it dawns on people who Jesus is. Now, John does this too, but the synoptics do it in a way in which the entire narrative is doing that. There's not the side comments or the direct statements that you get in John that always remind you about that first verse in John. So you watch it emerge in people's minds who Jesus is. So he calms the winds and the waves, and the question comes up, who's this who's able to calm the winds and the waves? And they obey him. And when we look at for what we call Christology in the Gospels, we tend as humans to want to know, so what did Jesus say about himself? And actually the way the synoptics work is he did talk about himself in spots, but he actually said, and he actually said this in John as well, don't believe what I'm saying, look and see what I'm doing. That way we get to the Christology of who Jesus is by the God stuff that he does while he's ministering.
I see.
And no story tells that as beautifully as the healing of the paralytic, which is, of course, in all three Synoptic Gospels and is a wonderful story that has a lot of interplay.
A lot of nuances to it.
It is. Yeah. And it's a story I love to talk about because I tease people. I said, we need to have an audio-visual Bible when we tell this story. And so I bring it with some sound, and I sit on the stage like the paralytic, and so the sounds go like this. The scene opens because, we've got these guys, they're trying to come to a full room to get Jesus to heal their friend, and the room's full. There's no way to get to him.
Can't get through the door.
There's no way to get up to the stage. So I say, well, we have a way of dropping in on the stage. So they go up to the roof, and the first thing you hear is whoompa, whoompa, whoompa. The next thing you see are little flakes coming down from above, right? And the next thing you hear is plunk as the paralytic drops in front of
Don't
Jesus.
You know the owner of that house really appreciated that.
I know, that's right. Now, I know there were no hydraulic lifts in the first century, but give me a break. I got a picture of how he got in front of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so he's sitting there in front of Jesus, wanting to be healed, and Jesus says to him, your sins are forgiven. When I tell the story, I tell people, this isn't in the text, but I guarantee you it's going on. If you were the paralytic in front of Jesus coming to be healed, and he said to you, your sins are forgiven, what are you thinking?
Ooh.
Yeah, you're thinking, that's not why I crashed this party. That's not why I showed up. What's going on? And then Jesus asked this wonderful question. He says, what's easier to say? Your sins are forgiven or get up and walk? It's a trick question. And I tell people, I'm a professor. I like to ask questions that separate the men from the boys and the women from the girls. And so what do? You find a question and you figure out if they can answer this question, they're ready to be a theologian. If not, they should be selling cars somewhere. And so it's that kind of a question that he's asking. And the trick is, in one sense, it's easier to say your sins are forgiven because there's no way to see it.
No way to verify it.
Exactly right. There's no way to see sins are forgiven. I tell my audience, if you've seen sins forgiven, just let me know what it looks like and send me the photograph. Bye, sin. Glad you're going away. Hope you don't come back. I mean, you don't see forgiveness of sins. But if I say to a paralytic, get up and walk, it's showtime.
Right.
Something's got to happen. Mm-hmm. And so he does this. Meanwhile, the theologians in the audience are reacting to the fact Jesus said, your sins are forgiven. And they're thinking, no one forgives sins but God alone. And that's our frame for the passage. No one forgives. And I tell my students that the theologians in the Gospels often are right about what they're observing, but they don't believe what they're thinking about. Or they believe the point, but they don't believe it applies to Jesus. So it raises the tension in the scene. And then I tell people, when people think privately in front of Jesus in the Gospels, it's bad for the person doing the thinking, okay? Because he kind of knows what's going on.
Right.
And so he injects himself and says, in order that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, get up and walk. And what he's doing is he's taking something that you can't see forgiveness of sins, tying it to something you can see that takes some type of unusual action or power in order to happen. That's the raising of the paralytic. And he connects the two. And all of a sudden, his words get demonstrated. And so it isn't just what he says that counts, it's what he does that counts. And actually, that's how the Gospels present Jesus, the Synoptic Gospels present Jesus all the way through. They show him doing
over and over again.
In all kinds of different ways. He's the one who's Lord of the Sabbath, for example. Think about that scene, the plucking of grain. 3 of the arguments that come out of Matthew are just good old Jewish arguments. Okay? David ate the showbread. That wasn't for him. How'd that happen? There wasn't any lightning that came down. He managed to survive. Think about that. Or the prophets say, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Think about that. Or the priests who work on the Sabbath. What do you do with them? Those are 3 good, what we call halakhic arguments about the law. It would have been a very Jewish way of thinking. But the fourth point that he made was a sledgehammer. Okay. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And then you have to understand there's a cultural script at work. The cultural script at work, of course, is the Sabbath and what the Sabbath means to a Jewish person. It's a special day. It's the Lord's day. So the way to ask the question is, who gets to be Lord of the Lord's day? And that's a very, very important question to answer. So that's a second example. Third example that I like to use, and this is one no one ever thinks of, is at the Last Supper. The Last Supper is a Passover meal. That is commanded in the Torah. Right. And the basic outline of what's to be commemorated is in the Torah. Jesus takes the imagery of the Passover and changes it and applies it to himself, who has the authority to do that with something coming out of the Torah. This is my
body.
Exactly right. My blood. Exactly.
This is a new covenant.
Exactly right. We've got a second Exodus happening. We've got a new way of thinking about salvation that's happening. Yeah. And he does that on his own authority. Who has the right to play with the Torah that way? So you start adding up all these things that Jesus is doing. He's raising people from the dead. Now, you can pick any one of them, and you might say, oh, there's an Old Testament example of someone doing that. But when you add the scope of what's going on and you see the range that it has, all of a sudden you're asking the question, all right, who's able to do this? Or the way I like to ask the question, who is this mass marauder who's shown up on earth and doing what he's doing?
Right.
That's how the synoptics work.
So it's not just a passage where Jesus says, I am God and please fall and worship me, but it's all this accumulation of evidence, right?
That's right. And it's built on cultural scripts, some of which we understand, but some of which we've become so distanced from, we actually don't appreciate the significance of the action that's undertaken.
That's why we have to understand through exegesis the culture that Jesus is in at that time.
Exactly right.
Great word today. Dr. Darrell Bock, thanks for being with us on Exegetically Speaking. If you learned too much today and your head is hurting, there's one sure cure. That is to share this podcast with a friend. We hope you've enjoyed Exegetically Speaking. If you have never visited Wheaton College, I hope you'll make plans to do so. We have a wonderful campus year-round. And if biblical languages are your fancy, check out our MA and BA programs at Wheaton College, wheaton.edu. Look for modern and classical languages. That's the best place to get started. If you have comments, you have questions, you just want to be in touch, please email us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for all those who make this possible. You know who you are. Until next time, thanks for listening.